All right, we're back again. And I want to thank the people who are sending in stories. And I'm going through them as quick as I can. Some of them, it wouldn't make too long of a story, but I'm going to figure out a way to maybe do a compilation. But let's get into this one. I hope you find it interesting, because I sure did. All right. Young lady says, I want to tell you how I found this. 3 months ago, I bought a small lot of books from an estate sale listing out of Lviv, Ukraine. Pardon me if I'm messing that up. Old things mostly, a few novels, some Soviet era textbooks, things that have survived a long time and traveled a long way to end up in a cardboard box on a resale site. When the package arrived, I guess she ordered it, I went through it the way you go through an old book quickly, checking the spines, flipping pages for anything interesting, pressed inside. In the back of the Ukrainian language ethnography textbook, a dense academic thing about pre-Christian Slavic folk ritual magic published in 1987, I found a folded document, handwritten, 31 pages. That's a big document. Dense, careful handwriting in Ukrainian. I had it translated. It took me 2 weeks. And the translator, a woman in her 50s who grew up in Kiev, sent me the finished document with a single message attached. She said, I don't know what this is, but I couldn't sleep while I was working on it. I kept feeling like I was being watched from behind. I sat with the translation for 6 weeks before I decided to read it. And then I sent it to you. I want to be clear about what I believe and don't believe. I believe the farmhouse described in this document is real. I found the village on a map. It was evacuated in March 2022. According to every record I can locate, nobody has officially resided there since. I believe the ritual described in these pages is drawn from a genuine document, Ukrainian folk practice. The ethnography textbooks it was hidden in covers the same traditions in academic language. The document and the textbook reference the same sources. I do not know who wrote this. I do not know if she's still alive. I'm going to read it to you exactly as it was translated. She goes on to say, the translator kept the writer's voice as close as she could. Some phrases left with the notes explaining that certain Ukrainian folk terms don't translate directly, that some things only exist in the language they were born in. This is one of those stories. The document has no title. The translator gave it one. She called it the UnBinding. And here it is. So I guess it goes to say, my name is Danya Kovalenko. I'm 38 years old. I was a school teacher in Kharkiv. I taught literature to children between the ages of 10 and 14. And I genuinely believed, that the story we give children are the architecture of who they become. I can agree to that. I'm writing this account because I need it to exist somewhere outside of my own head, not as a confession, not as a warning. I am past the age of warnings, as a record, because what happened in that house deserves to be recorded accurately by someone who was present before the details begin to soften the way details always do when we need them to. My husband's name was Mykola. I say was not because he's confirmed dead. There is no confirmed death. There is a date, the 14th of April, and a location, a field outside of a town I will not name, and a silence that has lasted 14 months. The army sent paperwork. The paperwork said missing. Missing is the cruelest word in the language, in any language, because it contains just enough possibility to keep you from grieving properly. You cannot bury the missing. You cannot say goodbye to the missing. Missing just sits there in the middle of your chest like a stone that won't stop being warm. My Kola had a habit of humming while he cooked. Not songs exactly, just a low, tuneless sound, almost below hearing. That meant he was content. In 22 years of marriage, I never told him how much I love that sound. You don't tell people things like that because you assume you have time. You assume there will be a better moment. You assume the person will be there tomorrow. I sold the apartment in Kharkiv. I sold the car. I sold everything that was essential. I found Bodan through a woman in my building who had lost her son. She had tried everything the official world offered: grief counselors, medication, a support group that met on Tuesday evenings in a community center that smelled like old coffee. None of it touched what she was carrying. Then she found Bodan. She wouldn't tell me what exactly he did for her. She just gave me his number and said, "He is not a fraud. He will not tell you what you want to hear, but he knows the old ways, the real ones, the ones that predate the church and the state and everything else that failed us." I called him. He was quiet on the phone. In a way, I recognized the quietness of someone deciding whether you can handle the truth or whether you need to be managed. I have that same quietness in my classroom when a student asks a question they might not be ready for the answer to. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to know if my husband is dead. And if he is, I want to speak to him one more time." Another long silence. He said that it's either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in this context or the most dangerous. I said, "I don't see the difference." He said, "I know, and that's what concerns me." We met 3 weeks later in Lviv, a cafe near the university. He was older than I expected, thick gray hair, the hands of a man who had spent decades doing physical work alongside intellectual work. A way of watching you that made you feel like he was reading something written slightly behind your eyes. He told me about himself without being asked. I respected that. He had been a professor of ethnography at the university for 22 years. He had spent those years documenting pre-Christian Ukrainian folk practice, the rituals, the spirit beliefs, the cosmology that survived the Soviet suppression by going underground, passed from grandmother to granddaughter in the kitchens and root cellars, and whispered over the heads of sleeping children. At some point, he said documenting wasn't enough. He said it with the way you say something you already made peace with, but still carry. Without apology, without pride, just fact. I crossed the line, he said, from studying to practicing. The university didn't understand the difference between those two things, and I didn't explain it well enough. So I left. Or I was asked to leave. Both things are true. I asked him if it worked, what he practiced. He looked at me for a long time. "Sometimes," he said. And that is the most terrifying answer I can give you, because sometimes means it's real enough to go wrong. I told him what I had, what I was willing to pay. He told me that the ritual required the isolation, the duration, the preparation I would need to do alone before we could begin. Months of dietary restrictions, no alcohol, no outside contact, progressive purification of the body and the mind, because what we were attempting required both participants to be as clear as still water, before the first invocation was spoken. I had already started. 3 months before I called him, something in me had known this was coming. I had already been preparing without knowing what I was preparing for. He saw that in me, and it made him cautious. People who are too ready, he said, concerns me more than people who are frightened. I am frightened, I told him. I am just also ready. He found the farmhouse, an abandoned kata in a village in the Carpathians, evacuated in the early months of the war. Traditional construction, thick walls, small windows, a root cellar below, a sleeping loft above, completely isolated. No neighbors within 5 kilometers. The kind of silence that has weight to it, a physical pressure, as if the air itself has thickened with the absence of human sound. He had stocked it in advance, 6 months of provisions, water from a well that worked, firewood already cut and stacked under the overhang of the eastern wall. We arrived separately on a gray October morning. The mountains were already losing their color, the forests going brown and rust and deep amber on the hillsides above the valley. The sky had the low, flat quality of a sky that has decided to stay that way. I remember standing in front of the farmhouse for a long moment before I went inside, looking at the carved wooden trim around the windows, traditional Carpathian folk motifs, flowers and birds, and geometric patterns faded now. Some of it cracked, but still there. Someone had loved this house. Someone had put care into it in the small ways that mean a place is a home rather than just a structure. I thought about that person, about what it meant that their home was empty now. Then I went inside. Bodan was already there. He had been preparing the space for 2 days, purifying it, marking it, laying the groundwork that I was not trained enough to do myself. He showed me what he had done without explaining all of it. I understood that some of it was not mine to understand yet. He showed me the circle drawn on the floor of the main room in chalk and salt and something dark I didn't ask about. Not a simple circle, layered, complex, filled with symbols I recognized from my own research, and symbols I had never seen in any source. Once I complete this, he said, no one leaves until the rite is finished. Not for any reason, not for an emergency, not for anything outside the world offers. So I guess they're going to seal the house. I understand, I said. Do you? He looked at me steadily. Because people always say they understand until the 3rd week, when the isolation begins to press on them and the outside world starts feeling like something they dreamed. I taught school in Kharkiv during the first months of the bombardment, I said. I understand what it means to stay inside a place where everything in you wants to leave. He held my gaze for a moment, then he nodded. He completed the circle. The first 2 weeks were ordinary. We established a rhythm, morning prayers, not Christian prayers, older ones, spoken in a formal, archaic Ukrainian that Bodan translated for me line by line until I could say them with understanding rather than just repetition. Afternoon preparation, physical work, ritual work, the slow, methodical building of the conditions necessary for contact. Evening documentation. Bodan kept records of everything, precise and academic, the old professor's habits intact even here. We talked more than I expected. He was a man of significant education and genuine curiosity, and 14 months of grief had left me starved for real conversation. We talked about the Ukrainian history, about the cosmology we were working within, the three realms of Prav, the celestial, Yav, the living world, and Nav, the realm of the dead. Not hell, not punishment, something older and less judgmental than either. A place where the dead exist in a state the old text described as waiting without urgency. Velez rules Nav. The old ones called him the god of the underworld, of cattle, of poetry, of wealth, of everything that moves between the states. Between living and dead, between wild and tame, between the world above and the world below. The church demonized him, made him a devil. The folk practitioners kept the older understanding that Velez is not evil, that he is simply the one who holds the doors between here and there, and that if you approach him correctly with genuine need and genuine preparation and genuine willingness to hear the truth rather than what you want, he will sometimes let that door open slightly. Slightly, Bodan emphasized, not all the way, never all the way. A slight opening is all we are asking for, enough to hear, enough to know. I asked him about the risk. He had mentioned them before, but I wanted the specific version now that we were sealed inside. He was quiet for a moment. The fire was low. Outside, the wind had come up in the valley, and I could hear it finding the gaps in the old farmhouse walls. The risk, he said, is not what most people assume. It's not that you will summon something terrible. Nav is not full of things waiting to attack the living. That is a Christian overlay of a much older understanding. Then what? The risk, he said carefully, is that you will make contact with something that is not what you called for. Something that has learned from long practice how to present itself as what you need most. Something patient enough to have prepared for your arrival. I absorbed that. How would we know the difference, I asked. There is a verification rite, he said. Old practice is something the genuine dead can satisfy, and an intruder cannot. I will perform it when the time comes. Will you tell me when you're performing it? A pause, I understand then. Yes, he said. That was the first lie he told me. It was also, I came to understand, an act of protection. Those two things can both be true. The first contact came in the 5th week. Not a dramatic, not the way the stories always describe it. No cold air, no candles guttering, no voice from nowhere. Just a quality of presence in the room that hadn't been there before. A feeling of being observed from the direction that didn't correspond to any wall. Bodan noticed it before I did. I saw him go still in a way a man goes still when he's listening to something at the edge of hearing. He said nothing, continued the evocation and the evening documentation. That night I dreamed of Mykola for the first time since the early months after he disappeared. Not a wishful dream, not the kind where you know it's a dream and you try to hold on. A precise dream, specific. He was standing in our kitchen in Kharkiv, and he was humming while he cooked, the low, tuneless sound, the one I never told him about. I woke up and I lay in the dark for a long time and did not cry. I was past crying. I was in a place beyond crying, where grief becomes something like gravity, constant, directionless, simply the condition of being alive. In the morning, I told Bodan about the dream. He wrote it down. His face was careful. What did he cook, he asked. I thought about it. Borscht. He always made it the way his mother taught him, with sour cream stirred in at the end. I used to tell him it wasn't traditional. He said tradition was just a habit that has outlived its reason. Bodan wrote that down too, underlined something, said nothing. Over the following weeks, the contacts became more frequent and more specific. Not always a dream, sometimes a texture in the air during the afternoon rituals, a density, a weight, a sense of a third presence in the room that arrived and departed on no schedule. I couldn't predict. Sometimes fragments during the invocations. Not words exactly, more like the impression of words, the emotional content of something being communicated without the language arriving yet. And always the specific details, the private details, the kind that couldn't be guessed. The way Michaela folded letters before putting them in envelopes. Always in thirds, always with the text facing inward. A habit he had from his father that he couldn't explain and never tried to. The name he called me when we were alone that he never used in front of anyone else. Not an endearment exactly, just private shortening of my name that had developed in the first years of our marriage and become the sound of intimacy between us. That name arrived in the 6th week. I guess she just hears the name? Oh no. Not spoken, but present. The way a word is present when someone is about to say it. I told Bodan, he was very still. Tell me exactly how it arrived, he said, what you felt, where you felt it, in what sequence. I described it carefully. He asked me to describe it again. And then he asked me 3 questions I didn't understand the purpose of. About the direction of the presence, about whether it arrived before or after a specific point in the invocation, about whether it felt like it came toward me or from within me. I answered all 3. He wrote it down. That evening, he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. His usual quietness was the quietness of a man thinking. This was the quietness of a man who found something he was afraid of finding. I asked him what was wrong. Nothing is wrong, he said. We are progressing. That was the second lie. I want to describe the farmhouse for you here because the house itself is part of what happened. Buildings absorb things. The old practitioners understood this, that a space where significant human experience has occurred holds an impression on it. And that experience is the way water holds cold after the ice has been removed. This house has held something. I felt it from the first day, but I attribute it to the weight of the general history. A village evacuated, lives interrupted, the specific grief of forced departure from a beloved place. Those things leave marks. I thought I was feeling those marks. In the 8th week, I found the objects in the root cellar. I had gone down for stored vegetables. The root cellar was low and dark and smelled of earth. And something older than earth, a sweetness with rot underneath it, like fruit that had been perfect and is now turning. I had been down there a dozen times without incident, this time in the far corner behind a stack of preserved jars. I found a wooden box that Bowden had not stocked. Inside it were objects I recognized from his documentation, folk ritual objects, specific objects associated with prolonged contact between the living and the dead. Objects that, according to everything I had learned, were used not for brief consultations, but for extended invitations. The difference is significant. A brief consultation calls to the dead and lets them speak and sends them back. An extended invitation opens a door and props it open. I brought the box upstairs. Bodan was at the table. He looked at the box. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that I had not seen there before. Not guilt exactly. The expression of a man whose calculations have been discovered before he was ready to explain it. Sit down, he said. Tell me about this house, I said. A long pause. A family lived here before the war, he said. A woman and her adult son. The son was ill, a long illness, years of it. The woman was a practitioner. Not trained, not formally. Folk knowledge passed down. She performed extended contact rites in this house for 2 years, trying to reach her husband who had died when the son was young, trying to ask him how to help the boy. What happened? The son died, Bodan said. The woman left the village before the evacuation. Where she went, I don't know. And the door she propped open? Silence. Bodan? A space where extended invitation had been practiced, he said carefully, is a space where the boundary is always thinner than elsewhere. It makes our work easier. Or it makes it more dangerous. Both, he said. Both things are true. I sat down across from him. I looked at him for a long time. He met my eyes without looking away, which I respected even then. Is that what we've been contacting my husband? I asked. I believe so, he said. The specificity of the details. Is it my husband? The long pause. Bodan says, I'm not certain. And I need you to understand that my uncertainty is not the same as a negative answer. It means I need more information before I can tell you with confidence either way. The verification right, I said. Yes, when? Soon, he said. When the contact is strong enough to test clearly. I left the box on a table between us, and I went up to sleep in the loft. I lay in the dark, and I thought about what certainty would mean, both kinds of certainty. If it was Mykola, if the months of preparation and isolation and the grief compressed into pure focused need had actually done what Bodan said it could do, then I had reached him. Then he was there, just on the other side of a thinning, reachable wall. If it wasn't Mykola, if something else had learned his humming, his letter folding, his private name for me, and had assembled these pieces from whatever source such things use to gather what they need, then something has been studying me for weeks, learning me from the inside out, building a version of what I love most out of my grief. I could not decide which possibilities frightened me more. This is what I mean when I say evil is the wrong frame for this. A thing that spends months learning someone's grief in order to give them exactly what they need, is that evil? The word feels too simple, too clean. It suggests that the thing is opposed to good in some organizing way. What I felt lying in the loft was something more than encountering a thing that was simple, other, that operated by rules entirely its own. That was neither malevolent or benevolent, but was in some deep sense interested in me, in what I carried, in what I was willing to do. The verification rite happened in the 10th week. I did not know he was performing it. He told me we were deepening the contact protocol. A new sequence of invocations, a progression, he said, was normal at this stage. I participated fully. I said everything he asked me to say. I held the focus the way he had taught me. The particular quality of attention required, open without being passive, present without being demanding. The contact arrived quickly, more quickly than usual, almost as it had been waiting. What followed was the most complete contact we had experienced, not fragments, not impressions, a genuine presence, sustained, clear as winter morning. The name again, details I had not shared with Bodan, had not shared with anyone, a conversation Michaela and I had the night before he left, standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, both of us knowing without saying it that this was the conversation they had to carry everything we might not get to say later. I had never written that conversation down. I had never spoken it to anyone. It lived only in me. And now it was here in this room, being returned to me with a completeness that broke something open in my chest, not painfully, gently, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long. I was weeping by the end of it, not from grief, from something closer to recognition. Bodan was very quiet through all of it. Afterward, when I had collected myself, I looked at him. His face told me everything before he spoke. It failed, he said. The verification rite, it failed. The room was very still. Tell me what that means, I said, my voice completely steady. I didn't understand how. It means, he said slowly, that we have been contacting, it means slowly that we have been contacting cannot satisfy the conditions. What we have been contacting cannot satisfy the conditions required of the genuine dead. It means, he started again, it means that this is in the house. This is in the house learned everything it knows about Michaela from you, from your grief, from the texture of your loss. It has been with you since before we arrived here, perhaps since before you called me. The night before he left, 2 in the morning, the kitchen, that conversation, I said, the one in the kitchen, if it learned everything from me, how did it have that? My voice broke slightly. I never even let myself think about that conversation directly. It did not need you to think about it directly, Bowden said. It needed you to carry it, which you have been doing every day. What is it, I asked. The old texts have several names for it, he said. None of them translate well. The closest in meaning is something like a thing that feeds on the shape of longing. It does not want your life. It does not want to harm you. It wants, he began to choose his words carefully, it wants to be wanted. It wants to occupy the space that grief has made. It is in its own way as lonely as you are. I absorbed that. That conversation in the kitchen, I said, whatever gave that to me, it felt like him. It felt exactly like him. I know, Bodan said. You can't know that. I know because of your face. Looked like, he said quietly. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I know what genuine recognition looks like. Whatever is in this house gave you something real. It gave you Michaelo as completely as it could. That is not a small thing. It's not him, no. He's dead? Bodan didn't answer, which was its own answer. I sat with that for a long time. The fire was low. Outside, the Carpathian dark pressed against the small windows. I want you to end this ritual, I said finally. He nodded. He had been prepared for this. He began immediately. What followed I will describe as accurately as I can, which means I will describe it in ways that will seem impossible to anyone who was not present and self-evident to anyone who has ever stood at the edge of something genuinely old. Bodan performed the unbinding for 6 hours. I will not detail the specific rites, not because I'm protecting anything, because they don't belong to me to share, and because the details are not the point. The point is what it cost him. He had told me in the early weeks that he had performed this work 3 times before, that once it had gone fully right and twice it had gone partially wrong, and that partially wrong in this work meant a cost he paid from something he couldn't name precisely. Not his health, not his sanity, but something in the space between those two things. A capacity, a reach. The unbinding in that farmhouse was the hardest thing I ever witnessed a human being do. It was not dramatic in the way stories make these things dramatic. No visible struggle, no physical manifestation, just a man working with total concentration for 6 hours against something that did not want to release what it had spent months building. When it was finished, he sat in the chair for a long time without moving. Then he looked up at me, and I saw it, what it had cost, not on his face exactly, behind his face, a dimming, as if the light had been on in him for 30 years had just been turned down to its lowest setting. He could still speak, still think, still function in every practical sense. But I knew something at him that he would never do this work again. That whatever he had used to reach across the boundary, whatever quality of perception or will or accumulated practice that allowed him to stand at the edge of Nav and work was gone, used up, given over in exchange for closing the door. He knew it too. I could see that he knew. It is done, I asked. Yes, he said, completely. The door is closed, he said. What was in this house has been unbound from the invitation the previous practitioner left open. It cannot return through that door. I noticed what he didn't say, but I said, in great honesty, it came to you before this house, he said, before the ritual, before you called me. Something that feeds on the shape of longing finds its ways to the longing the way water finds low ground. It was already in you. Is it still in me? I don't know, he said. The unbinding addressed what was in the house, what was in this house, and what has been with you. I cannot say with certainty that those are the same thing. I sat with that. The fire had burned down to coals. The Carpathian dark outside the windows had begun to thin slightly at the edges. The first gray suggestion of a dawn still hours away. Boden, I said, yes? The conversation in the kitchen the night before he left, I stopped. Was that Mykola? Any part of it? Even if everything else was constructed, was any part of that conversation my husband? He looked at me for a long time, said, I don't know. And I want you to hear me say that honestly rather than kindly. I genuinely do not know. The verification right test for the conditions of NAV, for the specific quality of presence that the dead carry, it does not test for the content of what is communicated. It is possible, I want to be careful here. It is possible that what was in this house learned Mycola's pattern so completely that it reproduced it completely true. Something he would actually have said, not because it was him, but because it had studied him thoroughly enough through you to know him. That's not the same as being him, but it's also not nothing. We left the farmhouse the following morning. Bodan Drive, we didn't speak much. The mountains were extraordinary in the early light. Frost on the high ridges, the valleys still in shadows. The sky above the peaks in shades of blue so deep and cold, it looked like something from before the world had names for colors. He dropped me at the bus station in the nearest town. We stood outside the car for a moment in the cold. What will you do? He asked. Go home, I said. What's left of home? He nodded. Bodan, I stopped. Was it worth it, what you lost? Was closing that door worth what it cost you? He thought about it genuinely. Didn't give me an easy answer. I've been doing this for 30 years, he said. I've been responsible for openings I shouldn't have made and closings that came too late. I've cost people things by being too cautious and cost people things by not being cautious enough. He looked out at the mountains. What I lost in that farmhouse, I had been using it wrong for years, using it to feel important, using it to feel like I was different from other people. Maybe losing it was what I was owed. He got in the car and I watched him drive away. Then it just says, I'm writing this 6 weeks after the farmhouse. I'm in Lviv. I have a small room. I found work tutoring children in literature, which is smaller than teaching, but is, I found, enough. Children still need the stories. The architecture of who they become still needs building. I think about Mycola every day. That has not changed. And I don't believe it will change. This is a pretty awesome story. Like I said, she doesn't talk about the right to specifically. And there's a little bit more that she says. But it's nothing that's going to change the story. She doesn't want her name known, so I'm just going to say no name. All right. If you guys have any more stories, like AIPMTWINS@gmail. AI payment wins. Keep that nightlight on.